Hello, we are back.
Poczekajmy, aż zbierze się jeszcze trochę więcej ludzi. Let's wait for a few more people. Thank you for being with us. It's great to see you once again here. Let's wait for CF Møller as well. Okay, I see that Julian is already with us.
Yeah.
Jak to zrobić?
Okay, jeszcze raz. Okay. Add you, Julian. Wait for a
Something
moment.
is happening. We are waiting for CF Møller Architects. And hello again, Julian.
Hello again.
Okay, so now it's part for your questions. Please send us some questions. We will try to read as much as possible to our guests. So, do you have some questions to our Master of Architecture?
Okay, so maybe we ask you about architect and the situation and in the world. So what do you think? What is the role of the architect in the contemporary world and contemporary situation?
It's becoming sort of increasingly complex because of the architect traditionally had a fantastically central role in every building complex or building process. And in a way that's been changing. You now have so many people coming together. There's so many consultants. There's so many different professions involved in any building or design process that in a way as an architect you can feel like you're getting marginalized a little bit. But it's not really true in that way that you still have, as an architect, a quite unique potential in bringing both ideas to the table, but also bringing together what everybody else's input is and synthesizing that into something which can become, you could say, a spark or a vision, which is that makes the whole difference in a project. And I mean, I talked about this project, The Heart, in ECAS, which was this idea of bringing multitudes of people together. Everybody brought some input, but the architect's role really became to start to say, well, how does this fit together? It becomes a huge puzzle, which only the architect really can put together. So in that way, complexity seems to increase all the time, and it does in many ways. So does the potential of our tools, but it's like a constant struggle to keep up with the level of complexity. But really what you have to focus on is that as an architect, you have a unique role, something that a few others, I'd say none other in the building process really can do, and that is putting together the pieces to create a larger vision, something that goes beyond just the functionality or the needs of the program or things like that, and trying to bring something which is then, like I say, an igniting spark, something that can actually make things happen, which otherwise just wouldn't happen. And now with the kind of complexity we're looking at in terms of climate mitigation and all these new issues that have come on top of the things that we're already working with, and which shouldn't be forgotten, because of course we're still building for people. We're still building also to create spaces that we will want to live in and work in. And so all of these values shouldn't be forgotten, but we have to add new issues on top of that. And you could say, yes, that just increases the amount of information that we have to deal with, but that's also really what makes it so crucial to have a good architectural vision and create something which really is worthy of the resources that we put into building.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Thank you. So we received a lot of questions, so
yeah,
let's start. The user M. Camo asks, thank you for your inspiring presentation. Could you tell something about your biggest fail and how did you figure it out?
Oh, well, you mean as a company, we have, like I said, we are almost 100 years of history. So you can imagine there's been some spectacular fails along the way. So I can't even think of one single example, but really every project has the risk of failing. So it's something that has to be navigated from day to day. There's no such thing as a completely safe or predictable process. you will forever have things popping up that will potentially throw your idea out of course. So in that way, I think it's more, I'll answer that question more with relating to process, because that is really the key in many of the things that we're talking about here. It's not just having a bright idea or a good sketch, but it's the ability to actually drive a process that can mitigate these pitfalls that every project has. Like I say, you can have the most terrible fails, and I think that's the process quality of that, and the ability to also put yourself in somebody else's perspective and understand where they come from, I think, and then the curiosity that comes with that as an architect, to want to understand why are we actually doing these things, understand our clients, understand the people who will live there or have to look at it in the end. Architecture is one of the few things that you can't hide from. You can't withdraw from architecture. You can avoid art if you don't like it, but you can't avoid architecture. It will forever be there. So I think the responsibility of an architect in that way is tremendous, but it's also our responsibility to try and get that perspective, other people's perspective. And the term curiosity sums that up quite nicely, and actually be interested in how will this work from a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
And the next question is, do you have some advice for young architecture studios?
Well, I mean, this, especially at this time, it is, of course, extremely challenging. I think it's challenging for everybody right now, especially the uncertainty to not know what will happen in the next months and years, etc. But this is quite similar in a way to the feeling when I started out, which was in the late sort of 80s, early 90s. That was also a time of crisis, though no comparison to right now. But there was a feeling that, how are we going to go forward from here? And of course we did go forward, and we went forward in ways which we couldn't imagine back then. I think that's the key point, to keep your optimism up in that way, and to find joy in what you can do, even though, I mean, it is tough, absolutely. But that the joy as a driver, enjoying the work and enjoying the responsibility that your work has, I think, is one of the key drivers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Also, we have something in the question panel. I hope that everyone see the question right now. What do you think has landscape architecture for a role regarding, can we have it bigger?
Mm-hmm.
I'm afraid that we can't read the whole questions. I can see only a part of it. So probably it's better to please write your questions in the comments, not in the question panel. So we will just read them from your comments, and I guess that it will be easier for everyone. So next question from Matulek. Can you recommend some places or sources to take inspiration from?
Oh, wow. There are so many. I mean, but literally, when I started out, there was pre-internet, and you would have to buy books to get new knowledge. And today, that's hardly the way it works anymore, because everything is online. The challenge now is to actually filter all the information that you have, and not just be overwhelmed by the constant flow of images, and Instagram being a source of that, obviously. So I think the inspiration is potentially everywhere, of course. There's a lot of very, very interesting sites and also interesting publications which try to focus on seriously addressing the new topics that we have to work with, the whole sustainability agenda as a large. But also, and I think that's one of the things that we also advocate, I will also still think that there is a lot of learning and a lot of inspiration in our heritage. And it's not all just about space age materials, which can be fantastically interesting and can be really give you new ideas for how architecture can be put together, but actually trying to understand some of the traditional ways of working also unlocks a lot of potential, because there was always much more thinking and much more knowledge behind that than you would tend to realize. So I think this balance between looking forward and still being conscious of the past, I think, is something that is very inspirational for architecture.
Okay. So next question. Maybe we should try again. Do CF Møller have a dream that hasn't been achieved and you want to pass on the next generation?
Oh yes, I mean we have plenty, and again we already had a lot of generations in our firm because we have such a long history. So we are continuously also passing that on to new generations, and we have plenty of dreams which haven't been realized. I mean we work in some of the sectors which really affect people's lives. We work a lot, for instance, with big hospital constructions, things like that, which are absolutely crucial, and at a time like this, obviously even more so. They're the focus of everything we do right now, the healthcare sector. But still, even there, you know, even despite possibilities that we've had, and we're certainly working with interesting projects and have been able to realize quite spectacular projects, but every single one of them always holds an unrealized potential, just as an example. So we really still dream of being able to build a project which brings all of these ideas to the table and shows how much more can actually be done with architecture and with architectural thinking in that sector. And not as an opposition to functionality, but something that really can enrich the necessary functionality and turn that into an environment. We have a saying, one of my colleagues says usually, dream of designing a hospital where healthy people will also want to go, really.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your answer. So let's move to another question. Okay, so now, yeah, we've got it. It's Misha Aha. What about heavy vegetation on a roof in a wooden building like Hagastaden? Whether the construction has special restrictions in this matter?
Well, there are no restrictions to start off with. Of course, the weight of a landscape on a roof can be quite considerable, especially if you want to have plants of a certain size. So a green roof can be everything from very, very thin and light to quite heavy. But the timber construction itself simply will have to deal with more load. And so it's not really something that excludes each other. It can be integrated in the way that, of course, a timber construction can take up more load if it has more structural strength or more structural members or whatever way you want to solve it. So we really don't see that as anything which is opposed to each other. What we try to advocate when we make these more complex construction is to say, well, we also don't want to be so dogmatic that we say we can only use one material, for instance. I mean, so it's fine to still think about the possibility of other materials like structural steel or concrete or brick, something like that. It's not something that we now should to drop and just say everything has to be timber from here on. But a lot of the things where we use materials with a heavy environmental impact, we might just as well use something which has a different impact. But it doesn't mean that we then have to limit ourselves in what we can design, or for instance, stop putting roof gardens or green landscape in, because that's definitely not the goal.
Yeah. Okay. Who inspires you?
Oh, wow, that's so many people, actually. Yes, I mean, I'm kind of like a sponge in that way, that I try to absorb enormous amounts of information every day from books and internet and everywhere. And I'm driven by that curiosity, really. So I constantly find new things which I think are super inspirational. I can't even sort of start mentioning all of them, but I really, some of the few that have stood out are the ones who've been able to kind of rewrite the rule book in a way. Architects who have been able to take sort of seemingly impossible situations and turn them into an advantage, or for instance, pushing material agendas, using materials which we hadn't really thought about could be used in that context, but suddenly they work. And so it's that kind of thinking, really. I mean, there's lots of great architects in the world, and a lot of them we feel very related to, because we really can see that we're driven by the same goals and we have the same ethics and ideas. but there's always a little bit of a difference in what comes out of that after all, which is also fascinating. So I think the most inspirational for me has been the ones who've truly surprised me and come up with solutions that we would never have dreamt of, really.
Great.
Okay, this time one question from the question panel.
Yeah.
What do you think is the most important thing when you build an architecture?
Oh, well, see, I think that's impossible because it will vary depending on what and where, and for who and with whom, especially. I mean, I've mentioned some time now that we're trying to engage with the user perspective. We even will go so far as to think about doing something which can be described as co-creation, inviting users into the design process and giving them not just a voice, but actually hands-on possibility of influencing the design. So I couldn't say as an architect that from the outset, there's always the same thing, which is the most important. I think that is part of the process to discover, with every project being different, every site being different, every program being different, and certainly people being different, that is something that's part of the journey, part of the discovery in every project. So again, you could say, if you have to answer the question, I would say the process is the most important thing in every piece of architecture, but it will never be the same.
Okay, thank you for your answer.
Oops. Okay, it's work.
Yeah.
And
Okay, let's take a look for another question. I think we finished.
So many questions.
Yeah, really a lot of questions.
Fantastic.
Okay, I think this one. So I was studying in Denmark for almost 2 years, appreciating Scandinavian design. I always perceive it is a canvas. It's simple to let yourself, user, decide what you want the space to become. It's not a question, it's just a comment. Okay, but we have a question here.
Okay, what sources can you recommend that to get to know about new technologies used in architecture?
Oh, I can't think of a particular site just now. You probably have to do a little bit of research in that. Let me just think for a second. I know that there are some sites there which are extremely interesting when it comes to, for instance, the timber construction. Try really pushing the research into that as well, because there's a lot of interesting research going on at the moment. I mean, the timber itself, of course, has a history, but what we can do with timber today is based on that it's actually processed with new technologies. And these technologies are constantly evolving, and I think that's a very interesting part of it at the moment. Also, there is, I can't think of a particular site to recommend, sorry, but I know that there are other issues which are also interesting. It's not just timber, it's also trying to reinvent the use of more classic material types like concrete, both in the way it can be used, but certainly also in the way it can be produced. I think there's some very interesting research going on in that area at the moment. And then even classic materials like brick and rammed earth and that kind of thing, I think is having a huge comeback, because again, there's both the possibility of creating long-lasting architecture. There's also the possibility of creating something that we can emotionally relate to, because it's an architecture that we can feel and which has an historic importance to us. And what we have to look at and what we have to tweak is simply the energy that goes into the processes, and that can be optimized in various ways. But I'm certainly not advocating just flushing all that historic knowledge and historic empathy or feeling in architecture, but actually trying to bring that forward. I think when you look at our work, I think that was very, very clear that we engage also with these classic materials and try to use them in interesting ways.
Okay, let's go to the next question. So how do you see urbanity and urban design in relation with continuous threat of pandemics in our present?
That's a super interesting question, because it was not something that we talked a lot about before this whole COVID-19 crisis, right? But actually it has always been there, because the whole modern movement, which is certainly was the thing that drove the modernism in Scandinavia, the whole Nordic functionalism, that came out of the 1918 pandemic and the Spanish flu. And on top of that, and other sickness, other health issues in the early 20th century, that created the one aspect of the modern movement, which was all about a new healthy city, a new hygienic way of living, the whole white modernism, which had this almost clinical connotations. That wasn't really, that was no accident. That was deliberately trying to create an architecture which was visibly clean and crisp and healthy, with plenty of daylight and air and green and all of these values, which we really feel strongly for and which define our heritage, came out of a reaction to former health crisis. And that can sort of easily be forgotten because it's been 100 years. But now we are reminded that that was actually why this whole Nordic movement started, and not just in the Nordics, everywhere in the world, but particularly our heritage came out of that. So for us, it's a really interesting time right now to pose these same questions. In general, I don't necessarily think that everything it will change in terms of design after COVID-19. I mean, I remember 9/11 when the talk was that we would never do high rises again, because we had now seen how dangerous that was. And of course, what we did in following years was build them even taller than ever before. So I don't think that neither as humans nor as architects that we will tend to say, well, okay, we've learned that lesson, now let's change everything. We'll certainly see a lot of things going back to normal at some point with the understanding of what normal is. But I think there's also an interesting opportunity to reinvent healthiness in architecture. And what's changed across these 100 years from the last big pandemic to now is that back then the world wasn't nearly as urbanized as it is today. And as the question implies, the urbanity has changed tremendously. And it's one thing which we already were quite engaged with even before this whole pandemic became the talk, is that we were looking at the future of cities and say, if we as humans will be 50 to 70% of everybody on the planet will be living in cities, and cities will continue to grow, at least most of them, then we also have to invent new qualities in the city and new ways of actually bringing nature back into the cities, because we'll go mad if we forever distance ourselves completely from, I mean, not just green, but in a wider sense, nature. So that was a big issue. All of the larger Scandinavian cities will all have strategies for how to integrate urban nature in every new piece of urban development. So it's something that's been taken very seriously already. And I see that expanding now, because with this pandemic layer on top of that, and the whole discussion of how do we deal with this, it becomes even more important actually to look at space allocation in the city and the presence of nature and the possibility of living your life in these urban conditions. I think the lockdown will end, of course, and that will not define our future. But we'll certainly have learned some things from having stayed in small spaces for so long, and the need to be able to combine that with outdoor qualities and with landscape and green and nature and I think that will give us interesting opportunities. And I think we'll certainly see easier ways of addressing these questions in the future, because all of a sudden now there is a much better argument for why that is important.
Mm-hmm. It's an important topic.
Yes, yeah.
But maybe something else. For example, what book are you currently reading?
Right now, actually, I'm reading a biography about Walter Gropius, the German architect, and it's not just a biography. It's actually a kind of an expose, which says, well, really, Walter was really a great scammer in that way, that he created one of the most well-known careers in architecture without actually having any talent. So I'm not at the point yet where I can vouch for that, if that's true or not, but it's certainly fascinating.
Great. So another question. Have you ever been bored with your own design and how you manage it?
Yes, well, I think that's actually an interesting question. Yes, I think it's unavoidable that you will be fed up at some point. I mean, it's an intensive work, and sometimes it takes years and years and years to realize projects. Even the fast ones take years, and bigger projects will take decades to realize. So it's really hard to keep up your spirits in that way. I think what we can do to deal with that, because any design will grow old at some point. Even what you thought looked really cool at some point, when you look at it again 5 years later, you go, yeah, okay. So that will happen to you even while the project is still in progress. And so I think that's one of the key points, or key chances to avoid that is by looking beyond design and focus more on impact, and the impacts of the project. That should hopefully be something which can keep your spirits up, because if it is just about how it looks, I think that will get boring. Even if it's crazy avant-garde design, at some point it'll look old. But the impact of projects, I think that is something that it's harder to calculate, it's harder to work with, it's a bigger challenge than just designing form, but designing impact, and that, I think, will keep you occupied for longer. So I think that's one of the things we try to work with, to avoid just mere aesthetics or mere superficial design, but trying to go a step deeper.
Okay, then I will take a look for another questions. So it's similar to the previous one. But what impact will the pandemic have on the way we conceive the architectural space? So I think it means probably if we can design thinking about living during a quarantine, or probably to design some cities where people can be safe also during some pandemic situations. That's how I understand the question.
Well, it only takes a good adaptable vaccine program to forget totally about this again. So again, I'm not so much thinking about what's going on right now with the lockdown and the quarantines. I think it has much more to do with, on the longer run, preventing these kinds of things from happening. And that will be increasingly difficult, because the reasons that they are happening is typically that we are actually forcing that with our human settlements. We reduce the biodiversity, we reduce the habitats, and we have our expanding cities, which we increase the density. I don't think that we will see that density goes away, for example. I don't think that everybody will move back into the country and that the cities will become low density. I think the trend will continue, but we will have to infuse that with some more clever ideas to mitigate the potentially disastrous results of that. But I don't think it's realistic that the whole urbanity now reverses and simply goes away. There are other drivers behind that, which I think will be far more powerful than this pandemic, which will pass, of course.
Okay, thank you for your answer. Let's take a look for some other questions. Okay, yeah. We have a new one.
How do you see the comeback of timber as construction model in housing?
I think that's one of the areas where it's tremendously efficient, because if you look at most housing constructions as they're sort of standardly done, for instance, in the Nordic countries, almost all housing will be prefabricated, either panels or units put together. And in most cases, housing is, except for a few sort of exceptional projects, housing tends to be fairly repetitive. It tends to be very cost efficient, and it tends to deal in standard spaces. Now, of course, that's also a challenge because some housing can become quite boring and uninspiring on the back of that. But certainly what you can do is you can very easily actually make a much better case for the use of timber rather than other materials in most of those applications, because it is, well, faster to work with, it is easier to transport inside these super dense cities, it is cheaper to work with on the construction sites, and it will have a completely different health impact on the people living there. So that's one of the key points of timber construction, is actually that it creates healthier indoor spaces as well. So in that way, in housing is one of the areas where timber holds so many advantages that it's pretty much a no-brainer to start using more of that.
Okay, so we have many questions for you, but the time is also limited. So maybe we ask the last 10 or 15 minutes. What do you think?
Yeah, that's fine. Let's do that.
Yeah, okay. So next question.
How do you see the comeback of timber as construction model in housing?
Oh, that was the same one.
It was the same one, sorry. It's the same one. But we have another one here. What would be your suggestion for a young architect that wants to move to Denmark to work?
Oh, wow. That's also a good question. I mean, of course, right now, Denmark is suffering from the same effects that that all the other countries that are in lockdown. So we certainly face a lot of economic uncertainty. And so right now is a difficult time to come to Denmark, just as I'm afraid it will be to go anywhere else in the world, really. So I would say wait it out a little first off, and then if you come to Denmark, I think it's certainly, if you bring talent, I think that's the most important thing, and that's something that we are forever interested in. Also, what's interesting also for firms in Denmark, most Danish architecture firms, the larger ones at least, are all working internationally. So for us, it's also an interesting thing to get a wider cultural understanding of other countries and other ways and other perspectives. So that's also something that you can bring to the table as a young architect. So I think those are some key points. I mean, but of course, talent is the most important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And the question, what do you think about 3D printing in construction?
I'm very much looking forward to seeing the possibilities really unfold. I think that the potential has to be there, but I haven't seen any applications yet which have been really convincing. So right now there are other methods of construction which seem to be more efficient, and I think that will be the key changing point. Sort of, when could you see printing actually really becoming efficient in relation to simply doing the same thing in a different process, or using other types of materials, for instance. So it's a little bit like with the same, this 3D printing started, you could start to print almost any shape, but whatever you printed would always be useless. And that's evolved. So now you can start to print things which actually have a use, have a function. And I think the shift is not yet there on the architectural scale. But I do see potential, but I think it has a lot to do with the material input. It's not so much the process of printing, it's more the question of what will the material input be. When we printed everything in plastic, it's not really super attractive to do that, just scale it up. And right now 3D printing is typically done in concrete, and that can hold some interesting possibilities for creating forms and shapes. But it'll be exciting to see if we can actually find different materialities which could then have different environmental profiles. I think that's a part of the potential as yet unrealized in that technology.
Mm-hmm. And I have a question about your lecture.
Yes.
Because your architecture is amazing. I saw that your interior design and exterior is very beautiful. So do you have departments in your office to deal with the individual parts, or do you design everything?
Oh, so that is very different. Some projects we get a chance to design everything, and we're very happy to do so, I must say. I mean, we really like the potential in that, but it's not always the case for different reasons. It can also be cooperations. We will do landscape work ourselves, and sometimes we'll also do it in cooperation with others, and the same goes for interiors and things like that. The most important for us is to be able to get some kind of integration. I mean, what we like the least is the kind of complete division between an urban design where nobody thinks about how the architecture will work, an architecture where nobody thinks about how the landscape between the buildings will work, and then an interior which hasn't had anything to do with the buildings it's sitting in. You know, that you can find that everywhere, but that's really what annoys me the most. So rather, if we can integrate, that's the most important part, and that can be done in all different kind of constellations and teams. What we do have in-house, and I think that's we do that because it's important for us. Like I said, it has to do with where we come from as a heritage. Is we do have specialized departments for industrial design, interior design, landscape design, etc. Yeah. Because we need to have specialists in order to be generalists. So if that makes any sense, but in order to be able to actually realize something that spans across all these different professional typologies, we need to have specialists at hand, but we also have to think like generalists and bring it all together. And that's the kind of integration that we are looking for.
Mm-hmm, thanks.
Okay, I think we have time for the last two questions.
Okay.
So now the question from Krzysztof Kafka. A question about the city spatial policy. Do the cities in Denmark expect the green roof gardens because of the climate change mitigation, or is it just your own decision?
Well, that's actually a really good question, because weirdly, and I would say this is quite weird, actually there's no demand or no provision for having green roofs in Denmark, which is odd, because if you look at everything else we do in the cities, that would be very, very natural to have that as a fundamental requirement. You will have that in Germany, for instance. In Berlin, we've been working for 25 years, and there you simply have to have every flat roof green unless you have a roof terrace or a garden or something else. But if any roof just sitting there will have to be a green roof. It's just like that. Actually, in Denmark, it's not like that. So it's kind of actually a bit of pushing always to try and bring that in. And of course, what is easy is to actually show the potential and the quality of a roof terrace, and to be able to in that way give the users and the people occupying the building that extra value. That's an argument you can make. What is much harder is actually to take the unused roofs and use them for green. You know, that's something that's very easily sort of taken out of the budget if there's a constraint somewhere. And that's always a struggle to get that in. But that's thinking about the wider biodiversity of the city and providing habitats in the city, even not just for humans, but also for other species.
Okay, so the last question.
The last question. How challenging is cooperation between all parties? How much compromises you need to take during the design?
Actually, that's also a really good question, because it is, of course, it's very, very challenging bringing different people and perspectives together that can clash in all sorts of ways, but it's also potentially extremely fruitful. And that's one of the things I say, you have to keep your hopes up, and you have to look at the process as maybe the most important thing in every project. That's where the potential is hidden to go beyond simply fulfilling the program or simply designing a beautiful facade, but creating something which is meaningful in a bigger way. That is in trying to bring these things together. And I think that's why exactly this question, how many compromises do we have to make? We have to make enormous amounts of compromises, but it's not a bad thing. I think you should not look at it in that way, that we as architects have the perfect solution and then everybody comes in and chips away at that until there's nothing left. But rather, it's actually trying to build something up from all these different parts and perspectives and try to create a new whole out of that, something which goes beyond what we would have imagined and certainly has a much wider impact than just the architect's personal vision. So I think that's what I said. We are not so much about a style. We're much more about a way of working and a way of thinking. And I think that's something we take pride in, is that we don't know when we start a project, we don't know where the journey will end. We don't know what it will look like in the end, but we are very interested in trying to bring different perspectives together to challenge ourselves as well. I mean, we use this integration of landscape and architecture to sometimes turn the process upside down and say, let's forget about the building and start with the landscape and then design the architecture so that it fits the landscape, just to challenge where we are going. That's how the Lego project happened, and that's how the Carlsberg project happened, for example. And those are just ways of challenging ourselves, but then inviting people from the outside in as well brings new challenges. And yes, you will have to compromise and you have to rethink what you were doing, but it can actually enrich your project and your process. And I think in that way, compromise is a really, really good thing.
Okay, thank you. So we saw that we received really a lot of questions. Unfortunately, it's not possible to read all of your questions, but I have the last questions to you.
Okay.
Are you going to come to Poland to speak for us live? When the
Absolutely, yes. I was so looking forward to coming, actually. Yes, so absolutely. I would love to come.
Okay, so when the situation gets back to normal, we schedule a date.
Yes,
but I
excellent.
Must tell you that our auditorium holds about 300 seats, but today we had 700
wow.
of viewers. So if it was a real life lecture, it wouldn't be possible to have such a big audience.
That's great. Wow, well done.
The meeting was amazing and your lecture was amazing. Maybe would you like to tell something to people who come to hear your lecture?
Well, first off, I'll just say thanks. I mean, I'm amazed so many people took the time for that. So that's I'm really humbled by that. So thank you very much for taking interest, first of all, and then I guess there might be a lot of architects among you, and I hope that this was some kind of inspiration that we were talking about. Where do you get your inspiration? This is also a way to get inspiration, and like I said, I was trying to make some points about what we're interested in, but of course we're also interested in hearing about what other people think is more important to work with, or how you can approach these things. So certainly I'm looking forward to coming to Poland and have that exchange, and I hope to see all of you somewhere at some point.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The lecture will be available on our Instagram profile for the next 24 hours, so I'm sure that we will have much more viewers than right now. We also encourage all of you to follow our Instagram profile. We also created a Twitter account recently, so you can also follow us there. And thanks again, Julian, for making time.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Thanks.
And see you in Poland. I hope that as soon as possible.
Yes, see you then. Okay, please stay safe, be healthy.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah,
bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, so thank you to all of you for listening to the lecture, and we wish you a great evening.
Bye.